Hello, everyone. This is Space Cafe Podcast, and I am Marcus. Hey, you all. Welcome back to Space Cafe Podcast. Before we kick this off, we would like to thank you for sticking around and sticking with us, especially through the tough days of launching a podcast. Seriously, it means a hell of a lot, considering the fact that we're just one click away from a bazillion other, perhaps cooler, fancier, smarter, and whatnot podcasts. So, thank you, and I'm pointing my finger right at you out there. Thank you for spending your time with us. Seriously. And you know what? Right now, I'm wearing a brand new fancy Space Cafe Podcast t-shirt with a pretty cool one-liner. Space Watcher, that is. Because Space Cafe Podcast is part of the rapidly growing SpaceWatch.Global network. And I think it's fair to say that SpaceWatch.Global is the one and only neutral voice when it comes to all things space. Because, you know, we love good stories and we do not care where they come from. Sound good? So, you know what to do? Get your SpaceWatch tee on SpaceWatch.Global and help spread the word about this podcast. It's episode 12 already, and you can find us, as always, on any of the major platforms. And if you like what we do, you might consider giving us a 5-star rating. I hate mentioning this, but hey, that's the only language the internet seems to understand these days. So thank you. On with the show. Today I'm extremely excited to present you someone who has stories to tell, lots of them. Because he spent 40 years in the space industry and witnessed almost every major space event from Apollo till now. Chris Lee graduated with a master's degree in space science in 1980 before joining British Aerospace, where he worked on programs that included seminal missions such as the Hubble Space Telescope, Giotto, or Envisat. In 1998, his work broadened to include roles in Beagle 2 and Exomars. Chris joined UK Space Agency in 2014 as head of international space policy, and then in February 2018, Chris became head of science programs and chief scientist at the UK Space Agency. And he played active roles in some of the most dramatic space missions in the history of human space travel. And that is exactly what we will be talking about in this episode. Because hey, what could be cooler than talking to an eyewitness of historical moments? Chris was a bit hesitant, though, to talk about some of those missions because they were not exclusively British missions and he didn't want to adorn himself with false laurels. I like that attitude. In the end, we finally found a way and went into Hubble, Beagle 2, and Exomars, just the way you expected. To kick this off, maybe an unusual question, Chris. You're an avid hobby astronomer and a distinguished expert when it comes to satellite observation. Now, when both collide, astronomy and satellite observation, sometimes major discussion is the consequence. I'm, of course, referring to Elon Musk's Starlink project. Astronomers hate it, and internet users will perhaps love it someday. On which side are you?
That's a really tough opening question, because I see both sides of the story, and it really is it's a difficult position to be on. But I think there is sense on both sides, and as long as the two communities are talking, then I think there will be some hopeful resolution. But yeah, you're right. As an amateur astronomer, I certainly enjoy going out there and seeing the night sky. Of course, I'm also very conscious of the professional astronomer who is, their livelihood depends on their ability to conduct their research. And I think the mega constellation type initiatives coming from Elon Musk, but also OneWeb and Jeff Bezos and so on, it's taken us all a little bit by surprise. I mean, there were the Galileo and the GPS type constellations, but there weren't so many of them. 30 or 40 in my history. It was a constellation, and we knew what perhaps to expect and how to avoid interference. But when we're seriously talking about 40 odd thousand and projecting what that might look like, I think the simulations are really beginning to raise some concerns with ground-based astronomers. And all we can really do at the moment is try and see what is the magnitude of the problem. We know it's a problem. What we don't really know is it irreparable? And indeed, Marcus, I think the focus has often been on the optical astronomers, particularly Vera Rubin telescopes, that sort of thing. But I really do worry about the radio astronomers.
A quick side note. Radio astronomy is the study of celestial objects that give off radio waves. With radio astronomy, science studies astronomical phenomena that are often invisible or hidden in other portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, like the one we're used to seeing with our eyes. We call that visible light, whereas it is still nothing other than an electromagnetic wave. Everything left and right of the spectrum is invisible to the human eye, but can be detected and made visible. Radio telescopes can see those invisible and hidden activities across the universe and are the tools for solving some of the greatest mystery of our cosmos. Chris Lee is worried about those guys.
Because for a variety of reasons, radio astronomy has been operating in dark, quiet quiet sites. Yes, they have their regulations through the ITU, which satellite observation organizations are very strict about responding to. So theoretically, there shouldn't be an impact. But we all know the reality is radio astronomy is also bleeding into the quiet zones around their sites, and they're obviously looking at radio frequencies that are slightly outside the constrained bands through the International Telecommunications Union. And I really think these constellations could be a real pain for them. I don't want to yet say it's irreparable as a relationship, because is the business case for Elon Musk actually going to work? Are we going to get to 1,000 satellites and perhaps the business doesn't happen? And, he and others perhaps decide it was a great idea, but it doesn't happen. And we just have to worry then about orbital debris, which is a different issue. I heard your conversation a couple of weeks ago with Mariba. But, I sit in my astronomy circles, my amateur astronomy circles, and they're saying, hey, you guys on the satellite side, what on earth are you doing? But, there is no legal requirement to protect the night sky.
Wow.
There is no law that these satellite companies are breaking. I mean, they're being very responsible, but we just haven't thought of framing legislation to protect the night sky. And I think that's a wake-up call for us all now.
So, I mean, if I had the necessary funds, I could build my own mega constellation. Is that right? Without asking anyone?
Oh, no, you have to. There's a number of things you have to do. There is a regulation, but it's not necessarily affecting the night sky. So the issue is you can launch, you've got to get approval to launch. You've got to satisfy a launching authority, usually the country that you are installing your company in. They have to approve your worthiness, if you like, for a license, that you're fit for purpose, that you're not going to just simply launch a satellite that will die in orbit very quickly and then cause debris. You can only transmit to and from that satellite if you've got license approval from the International Telecommunications Union, because as you can imagine, you've got to send commands up and receive data down. So, there are these legal restrictions, but no one's actually saying, well, how bright are you going to be in the sky? There is no regulation I'm aware of that simply says, hey, I want to go up in space and create an electronic billboard, a bit like you see in Blade Runner. I think at the moment there's no legislation that says that. And yet when you think about an Earth-based situation, if you want to build a row of houses, quite often there's an environmental impact analysis that you have to form. What wildlife are you going to impact and so on. I'm not aware that sort of thing really exists yet in satellite world, because we've never imagined the sorts of business cases coming forward. But, now we have billionaires who are prepared to take the hit in the early years to launch their constellations, which never existed 10 years ago. We're now facing these challenges.
Now, I think I'm repeating myself. It's such a privilege to have such a distinguished guest on the show, and you have such a rich history of historical and sometimes very dramatic experiences in your work life. We will be talking about some of those. We will talk about your involvement with Hubble, a very dramatic experience, I guess, in the very beginning, then Beagle 2, Exomars. So would you say that throughout your life, your work as a space scientist, space engineer has been accompanied by drama?
Not at the time. I mean, the way you describe it, of course, yes, I've had 40 years of experiences. That's simply because I've managed to have a 40-year career in space. I mean, sometimes I meet some of the younger members of the community and realize my entire career in space is before they were even born. So
right.
That makes you feel a little old. So I've had the opportunity to be involved in space during some very exciting times for our community. So it's only when I look back at the time, it was a job. I mean, there are things you do as an engineer. There are clearly opportunities to, recognize the importance of what you're doing. But at the end of the day, also, it is a 9-to-5 job. And I once had a really good friend of mine who used to say to me at work, he said, you guys, you get so stressed about what you're doing during the day, but your real crisis is when you walk home in the evening and open the front door. That's a real crisis. That's where you have things that are happening at home. And I think it grounds you a little bit. I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've had some fun times, but I think I look back on that now that I've retired with appreciation. At the time, no, I just thought it was just a day job.
Wow. Let's talk about Hubble, if that's okay for you.
Yeah.
Hubble is perhaps one of the most influential man-made objects in space. I think it's fair to say is it has reshaped and defined our vision of the universe, how we understand the universe. But it all started with a very dramatic situation.
Yeah.
Namely the one that the multi-billion-dollar telescope was more or less blind when it opened its eyes for the first time. Were you on board the mission already when all that happened, when it got launched?
Yes and no. When I joined, I studied astronomy at university and decided towards the end of my period at university that actually I quite enjoyed the engineering side of things as opposed to simply being out on the top of a mountaintop looking into deep space. Besides which, an awful lot of that these days was being done by robotic means as well. So there wasn't so much there going out to the observatories. But I decided I'd like to move more into the space engineering side. And so took a master's in space science and engineering and had the fortune to manage to move over to a company at the time called British Aerospace, based in Bristol, where I was a payload engineer. And the first job I had in the company was to work on the photon detector assembly unit, which was part of the European Space Agency's contribution to Hubble. And yeah, it was, at the time, I don't think we'd really appreciated just how dramatic Hubble images were going to be. I mean, it was, yes, you were working on a space telescope. That was going to be cool. But the reality was, I don't think we appreciated the magnitude of the impact it was going to have. And I moved on during the course of that work to start working on the solar arrays. Because the solar arrays were also being built by the European Space Agency to keep the telescope in orbit. And they were going to have to be retrievable in orbit. I mean, this was quite a challenge at the time, and that became more of the focus. I mean, we were really beginning to think about telescopes for the first time going in orbit, maintained by astronauts. And we just assume everything on the space telescope was operating fine in the design teams in the USA. So actually, it was a bit of a shock to us all once the telescope was launched. And then we started hearing about these problems coming through, which we had no insight in at all. I mean, we were concerned it might be our payload.
Wow.
That might be the problem. Or it might be our solar array that perhaps was causing some of the issues. But it very quickly became clear that there was this problem with one of the cameras. And hey, the rest is history.
To build a telescope that's in fact blind, I mean, it can't get any worse.
No, he can't. And, we'd done a lot of, European Space Agency in particular, had done a lot of PR around, what this telescope was going to represent. And we were all hoping that, it was going to be quite, exciting for the first images. But, there was a lot of backpedaling at that point, thinking, well, what do we do? And then we had to refashion it along the lines of, well, actually think about it a moment. If this had been a traditional telescope, end of mission. Mm-hmm. But actually, Hubble Space Telescope was built with these sorts of issues in mind, and we could repair it. People came up very quickly with interesting approaches to how that might happen. It wasn't really being done by the Europeans. It was very much in the USA. And we were able to turn it around and say, hey, look, this is what you can do if you can retrieve an object and repair it. And then, by the way, of course, as you know, Marcus, the history of Hubble was always built around the idea of upgrade. The instruments would be improved because instruments change very, very quickly compared to the lifetime of the telescope. So in what looked like a disaster in many ways made the mission. It became a focus for people to say, look what you can do with satellites in orbit if you can repair and update and replace. And then we held our fingers, kept our fingers crossed. And then when we saw the images come down, and that the faint object camera was absolutely fine, super.
Wow. So can you recall your first reaction to the first sharp images it produced? So how did that feel to you, not as a scientist, but as a person fascinated about the universe?
Yeah, I can, as an avid a professional both and practical amateur. I didn't believe it. You look at those pictures and you think it's a simulation. They've sent the wrong one. It's a simulation that's come through. But no, it was such relief, I think, to see it delivered. And then with these first light images that, there's an awful lot of tweaking that still needs to be done, which will improve that image. So, what you were seeing was a glimpse of what could be, what could happen.
Was that already in color, or was it black and white?
No, by the time I saw it, along with so many others out through normal circumstances. Remember, at the time we didn't really have the internet in quite the way we have it now. So there were images passed across through various fax machines as well. It was color. Yeah.
Wow.
We knew it was false color. We understood what that meant. I think there were a lot in the general public who didn't necessarily appreciate what that meant. But gradually, of course, that just became history.
Hubble images are all false color, meaning they start out as black and white and are then colored. Most often it is to highlight interesting features of the objects in the image, as well as to make the data more meaningful. Sometimes colors are chosen to make them look as our eyes would see them, called natural color, but not always. HubbleSite.org has all the information on how natural color imagery is created. So now the Hubble era is coming to an end. After 30 years, slowly retiring. How does that feel to you? Because, this is the telescope of a generation.
Yes, it is. A couple of thoughts, really. First of all, telescopes have to die eventually. Now I speak as a government official involved in the programs, and you realize that, it's like weeding. You do at some point have to take some of the missions away to let the new ones come forward, because otherwise these missions can go on and on and on. If there are no replacements, of course, you're really grateful. And in Hubble's case, of course, there wasn't any real replacement because we were all expecting James Webb.
NASA's James Webb Space Telescope is currently scheduled to launch in March of 2021, after years of delays and billions of dollars spent over budget. While it's easy to argue that all the time and money has been wasted, this observatory will be the premier and undisputed champion of infrared wavelengths, giving us unparalleled access to corners of the universe currently inaccessible. James Webb Telescope will be able to see a much larger portion of the infrared spectrum than Hubble and collect 6 times more light. It will complement and extend Hubble's observations to become the world's premier space observatory for the next decade. So far, we know of more than 4,000 exoplanets, planets orbiting stars. Do any of these worlds host life as we know it? James Webb will take us another step closer to finding out?
I think we're grateful, actually, that the mission hasn't been switched off because we haven't got James Webb yet. Similarly, we had another program that was very familiar to the team at Bristol, which is something that's a very European venture, but was something we're very proud of, which was SOHO, which was a satellite that is observing the sun. And again, it was another one of those missions that went on, and we were expecting there to be follow-up missions, and it was time to put the mission to bed. And we still haven't put it to bed yet because the follow-up missions haven't really taken place. So. Bittersweet. I think there's a time at which you have to move on, but if you're getting good science, as we still are from Hubble, hey, let's find other ways to keep the mission alive.
Absolutely. How will Hubble die?
I guess at some point, someone will literally just send that final command and switch it off, and eventually it will re-enter into Earth's atmosphere. I don't exactly know when it will be. I don't think it's for a while yet, but eventually it will come back. So that's how the official mission will end, but that switching it off is effectively the death of the mission. And so that hasn't happened yet. There's still enough science being done and enough funding being found by various sources, but at some point that will end.
Thank you so much for that. Chris, you retired from your most recent position as the chief scientist at the UK Space Agency. And to be super honest, when I did my research on the UK Space Agency, I was surprised to find out that this venerable country with such a long history has an agency that's so young. It was founded on April 1st, 2010. The UK is not your obvious choice for a space nation, considering the fog, if there's...
It's true.
Why is there a UK space agency?
Let's unpack that. I think it's fair to say the UK traditionally has had a very utilitarian view about space. I mean, either it's useful, in which case we want to use it, or it's not, in which case there's other things to spend money on. I mean, there's so many pressures. So certainly in the early days, the focus was very much on the science of space and the science from space. I think very early on, our focus was very much on satellites. We had a crossroads we reached in the early 70s where, we had the ability to potentially develop launchers as well as satellites. But for a variety of reasons, the UK really wasn't able to do both. They're quite expensive to go down both routes, and chose to go down the satellite route and perhaps stand back from launches, and decided to make its investment more through the European Space Agency and become a user of rockets, but became a much stronger developer of satellites and instruments to either look back on the Earth or look out into deep space. And actually, for the majority of the following 30 years, the UK was very much about applications. It's really only since 2012 and the involvement of people like Tim Peake getting more established into, what you can do with astronauts in space and the International Space Station, have we ventured a little bit more back into the human spaceflight activity. But I think we would still characterize the UK very much around show the practicality of space to the citizen, because ultimately a lot of the money that we spend is on behalf of citizens, and they always ask questions, why can't we have 4 new hospitals versus that particular satellite? So I think we're more conscious of that, perhaps.
Sure. Some say that we are currently in a golden age of space science. How do you, from your historical memory, you witnessed the Apollo days, you witnessed the Voyager days and the discoveries, you witnessed the space shuttle years and everything that came after that, the ISS, of course. So is this a golden age that we're venturing into?
Yeah, I really do believe that. I think it's a golden age for European space science, as opposed to space science more generally. What do I mean by that? I think you're correct. Hubble sort of demonstrated that satellites have come of age in their ability to showcase science and discover things. I mean, we know about the planetary probes that were really coming out, as you said, with Voyager. And I think in some senses, you take your hat off and say the Americans are very much linked with the planetary exploration programs. I mean, you think of their Discovery missions recently with Pluto and so on. What excites me to some extent, though, is traditional astronomy, black holes and, those sorts of things. And here I've seen, it's Europe that's taking the lead. I mean, we had the Hubble Space Telescope, yes, and there was European involvement. And we will have James Webb, and there's a significant European and UK involvement in that. But actually the UK and the European Space Agency together with other nations in Europe have really stepped up to the plate with programs like Herschel and Planck and Bepi Colombo. Perhaps these are missions that don't get as much publicity as their American counterparts, because of the way that the PR works more generally. But I have to say, I'm just blown away with some of the science coming out. For example, a mission like Gaia. I mean, Gaia in astronomy terms is perhaps even more important than Hubble, because it's going to the foundation of, what astronomers need to know. They need data. They need to know where things are, where stars are.
Could you tell us a little bit about that mission?
Gaia, I wasn't involved in Gaia specifically, but certainly the European Space Agency heavily involved in the astronomy community. So Gaia is an astrometry mission. So it's about with a really powerful set of camera CCDs. It's the largest ever flown in space. They are detecting the positions and speeds of stars in our galaxy. I mean, they're detecting about a billion stars in our galaxy and identifying where they are very precisely and what speed and whether they're approaching us or moving away and so on. And because, of course, you're looking back through the galaxy, you get a much better view, if you like, an archaeological view of stars and how they formed and where they came from. And because you can now see and track stars through their motions, you can work out where they were born, where they're moving and how many times they might have moved around the galaxy. You can really start formulating science hypotheses because you have the raw material, the evidence. And perhaps it's not as sexy as a picture of a cloud formation where stars are being born that you get with Hubble, but it's really doing the hard graft that allows astronomers then to say, hey, this is a class of star we never really thought about. Or these stars are moving, perpendicular to the plane of the galaxy. So in which case they're coming out from other galaxies. They're coming in from the outside, as it were. And it will lead to a body of information that will be used for 50 to 100 years. It's that important.
Fascinating.
Quietly getting on and doing its work.
Fascinating. But this brings me to a very obvious question. What is ESA doing wrong when it comes to publicity management?
Yeah,
gosh. Yes, I mean, like everyone will say NASA or SpaceX these days.
Yeah.
So why not ESA?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's getting better. I will say, I think it's getting better, but I think the challenge is perhaps not fully understood. I mean, ESA is not NASA. ESA is a collection of, 20 odd member states. So if there is a satellite to be launched and you want to put a press release out on that satellite, you've got to go through, press procedures from 20 odd countries. It's not as straightforward. And then you've got to probably produce it in 16 different languages,
right.
Something like that. It's not as easy as that. And besides which, I think the Americans have just fully understood that PR is a tool. It is part of the process. They spend more of a mission's budget in the PR side.
Say that again. More of a mission's budget.
More of the mission's budget in terms of PR and marketing, because they recognize how important it is to get in front of the general public. I think ESA doesn't have that benefit. I think ESA is funded by member states. Member states all come together every few years and agree how much they're going to spend their money on, and they want to spend their money on things, missions or technology. Science. Somebody comes along and says, "Oh, can I have a bigger marketing budget?" Most ministers turn around and say, "Well, no, perhaps we'll cut the marketing budget and we'll spend it on another satellite." So I don't think they've fully grasped how the general public need to be fed really good quality videos and information at a high cadence, coming out on a regular basis. Now, you take a program like Rosetta, transformational. I think the team that were involved in the ESA mission and the PR side of that, full applause to them for what they did and how they did it.
Let's jump back to that fascinating mission that drew tears to my eyes as it ended. The Rosetta spacecraft followed a 10-year mission to catch a comet and land a probe on it. Launched in 2004, the spacecraft arrived at its target, Comet 67P, Churyumov-Gerasimenko, on August 6, 2014. After a setback in which a lander did not deploy correctly, the orbiter continued to study its comet for almost 2 years before plunging into the comet's surface. The mission included the Philae lander, which made the first touchdown on a comet. Unfortunately, it didn't stay down. Scientists at the European Space Agency said Philae unexpectedly bounced twice before landing on the comet when the probe's anchor-like harpoon system failed to fire. Philae ended up in a shadow near a cliff face on the head of the 4-kilometer wide comet, which scientists say is shaped like a giant rubber duck. The probe fell silent on November 14 as its solar batteries ran out of power. When the comet drew near the sun in July 2015, Philae briefly woke up, connecting to the orbiter a handful of time before falling silent forever.
Linking it to the sci-fi movie that came out associated with it, the 12-minute piece. I mean, I know so many people who came back to me and said, "Hey, that was really cool. Well done, you Europeans for getting involved in that."
Is there anyone out there who would oppose to that success from within the ESA community? I mean, this is obvious to go down that route.
No. The trouble is, it's all about the ability to fund that. And how do you get the resources? You've got different departments. I think probably it comes down. I remember when I was in industry and I tried to get a press release approved on associated with Envisat many years ago, an environmental satellite, and it was fairly tortuous. You had to get so many
signatures,
agreements as how you would, exactly, just to get that thing through.
Okay,
it's a challenge. You're right. I mean, you get something like Elon Musk. Boy, has he hit the ground running. He recognised it very early on. We tried and we will probably talk about later on about programs like Beagle, but, we tried even with Beagle to be very different in the way we attacked the opportunity. In many ways, we were perhaps a bit too early. We were new space before new space was cool. I think there are different ways now of addressing the media. I'm sure ESA will come through eventually.
Before we get to Beagle and Exomars, you mentioned Gaia observing up to 1 billion stars. So just out of curiosity, how much is there left to observe in the entire universe? How much is 1 billion?
It's, there's the usual tropes that come out about, how many stars are there in the universe, whether it's how many grains of sand is there on the Earth. The number of grains of sand on the Earth. I think I've seen someone come along and say something like the number. If you imagine all the grains of sand around the Earth, well, that represents all the galaxies, in the universe, let alone the stars in the galaxies in the universe. Wow. I mean, we've scratched the surface. I mean, we're nowhere near having done all the science that we need to do.
Okay, so there's a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do for the oncoming generations. So let's go back to your work you did on those exceptional missions, Beagle 2 and Exomars. Both missions also turned out very dramatic because both resulted in partial failure. So could you go into that? Let's start with Beagle first, for example.
Okay. Well, Beagle is one of those missions from my point of view. I mean, you look back on your career and say, what were you most proud of in terms of an event or an activity? Engineers are often asked that question at their retirement. What was the most exciting? What gives you proudest moments and so on? Despite its problems, it would be Beagle for me, partly because it's one of the opportunities I had to see it from cradle to grave. So, you had the opportunity to be involved in the very early days and then see it all the way through to its conclusion. Whereas quite often in a space mission, you sort of dip in for part of the program and then you dip out while the next phase of the program moves on.
By the way, Beagle 2 is an inoperative British Mars lander that was transported by the European Space Agency's 2003 Mars Express mission. It was intended for an astrobiology mission that would have looked for a past life on and down to 1.5 meters under the surface of Mars.
My role at the time was also trying to make sure there were ways to get the program funded and developed and approved. And of course followed it through its gestation, through its various routes, trying to promote it to the UK public, a bit as you just said. The UK public never heard of the UK Space Agency. Well, it didn't exist as a space agency, but we had the British National Space Centre. But how do we get Beagle on people's agenda? And, we had very weird and creative ways. I mean, we had to take the Beagle model to places like the Chelsea Flower Festival, which is a very popular festival in the UK, to get the general public to hear about the Beagle program, and getting it advertised in really very obscure magazines to raise the consciousness that here was a group of scientists in the UK trying to do something very, very unique. I think we had a lot of resistance from ESA, who were a little concerned that this new space community, if you like, were going to be putting something on the side of their mission, Mars Express. Which could cause some damage and some concern. And, were we going to demonstrate full compliance against all the usual design requirements of a top class mission going to the planet Mars? And clearly we had difficulty in doing so. But then, of course, we had the wonderful bittersweet memory of going along to see the landing, what we hoped to be the landing on Christmas Eve, 2003, where we all trooped in to witness the landing with Colin. And we were, you might remember, I don't know, that in order to make it quite exciting, a pop group called Blur provided the call sign that was going to call home from the planetary surface. We had an artist, Damien Hirst, had done the calibration target.
Wow.
All these sorts of things. And there we were, 5:00 on Christmas morning in London, waiting to hear the call sign, and it never came.
Wow.
We never heard from Beagle again. And, I had to go drive home on Christmas Day, and my family still say it's the Christmas that was cancelled because I, wasn't in a good mood. And then, of course, 2016, images from the Americans showed that Beagle had indeed landed, semi-successfully landed, with 3 of the 4 panels deployed. That unfortunately meant the communication channel couldn't work. It is very possible that the Beagle was on the surface actually taking pictures as it should do, but just had no way to ever send that information back to back home.
How did that feel back then when there was no signal? Of course, you keep hoping for a day and 2 days and 3 days.
Yeah, you do. And we had friends and engineers who were immediately switched in to say, hey, what could have happened? Engineers go through the usual mission of, okay, we haven't had the signal, but that doesn't mean it's gone. I mean, it could be there's this problem, that problem. There were contingencies, and, Jodrell Bank were brought in to try and do some work. And people at Leicester, who were really at the mission control, they were working all over that Christmas period, trying to make sure that, they had thought through all the various command options, and gradually it does fade away. But no, the initial feeling is the very opposite to what you then saw a year later when the Americans landed. And there were high fives everywhere in the JPL mission control room. And I think actually I felt worse when I saw that than I did on the morning of Beagle, because to some extent you were always, as an engineer, there's a risk of failure, and you accept it, you embrace it, you try to move on from it, but it can happen. And when it does happen, there's an element of, what a shame it wasn't to be. But then when you see others triumphing
succeed
later on, that's when you think, gosh, that could have been us.
Right.
So near.
Right. Then another dramatic mission, Exomars, in 2016, I guess that was.
Yeah, although let's be clear, for the sake of this podcast, this was not something that we in the UK had too much connection with, because we're involved in Exomars, but the focus for the UK is very much the rover.
Yes. In 2016, the first part of the two-part joint ESA-Russian Exomars mission, resulted in partial failure when the Schiaparelli lander crashed into the surface of Mars due to a measurement failure in one of its inertia units. Schiaparelli was intended to pave the way for an ensuing rover mission, which was slated to launch in 2020 and just got delayed to 2022 as a result of problems with the parachutes, which could not be resolved in time for the launch window.
We built the Exomars position, if you like, in the UK from the ashes of the Beagle program. So, the Beagle investment allowed us to take a very strong role in ESA's follow-on program called Aurora. That led to the UK deciding it wished to take a leading role in the rover, again playing back to the UK focus, which was science. And hey, if a rover can do it, then why not? Let's focus on the autonomy and the opportunities to bring that technology back onto Earth as well. But of course, it was a joint program with a lander through the TGO program. So Trace Gas Orbiter was part of the Exomars doubleheader. UK being involved in one of the instruments that successfully operates today around Mars. So part of the TGO was to try and demonstrate a lander to help understand what might happen then for the rover. So if you like, it was a technology demonstrator. And as you allude to, 2016 comes along. This is ESA now having a go at landing on Mars. I mean, we had tried to land on as a bunch of amateurs, if you like. Some had pointed out that, well, you were doomed to failure because you're a bunch of amateurs. But, this is ESA coming along. And the fact that the mission didn't land successfully just underlines the fact that space is hard.
Wow. And Mars is unforgiving.
Mars is I think I've seen something like a third of all missions that have gone to Mars have somehow fallen over. And sadly, what TGO did do, and the lander did do, was it learnt the lessons from Beagle, and it had enough information coming back to the mothership so that the situation for the failure was understood. Information allowed the engineers to say, hey, that's what happened. Okay, we got 98% of what we really wanted out of the mission.
Sure.
We didn't get the last 2%, but we'll build that into what we'll now do for Exomars when the rover arrives. So we'll take the benefit of the failure into the Exomars program for the lander, for the rover.
Chris, as we are slowly but gradually closing in on a crewed Mars mission, do you think it would have made a difference for those failed missions if it had humans on board? Or will future Mars landings also be autonomous landings?
Yeah, it's a tricky area. I mean, my own perspective is that I think there is a misconnection these days between satellites and human space flight. If you ask the general public what you think space means, they'll say, astronauts, the moon, Star Trek, perhaps. But if you ask them what's a satellite, what does a satellite mean to you? Then they might probably say, weather satellites, or, it's TV or in-car navigation. I think space now means two things. I think to the general public, the benefits we get from space that we wish to protect and secure and nurture and promote are satellites. These things are what we take into government and say, look, can you support, assist, fund, demonstrate, because we can show you that space is a great way to save money. Whereas at the moment, many politicians and financial experts in governments regard space as cool because of the human spaceflight side, but they think it's a great way to spend money, and it's a mindset issue. So I need to get across to people that space is primarily these days, 90% of space is about satellites and what satellites can do. And it can do dull and boring stuff, along with really cool and exciting stuff. Satellites observing the universe, absolutely fantastic, exciting STEM outreach stuff. But these things will all happen if we never fly another astronaut in space. Ever. If we stopped tomorrow, we would still have a space industry growing and becoming ever more important. If we look at human spaceflight is meeting a different need. It's often being cited as it's part of human destiny, that we're born to explore. I think there's a case for that. I think the case is a bit weak. I think you have to look at how you justify the costs of such an equation. But if you have humans in that loop, I think society today is much less forgiving about failure. They're more nervous about deaths associated with it. I cannot imagine what it might be for humankind to look up at the moon in, say, 20 years' time, and let's say there's a disaster on the moon after Artemis, and that 10 astronauts in a moon village type environment die on the surface of the moon. Will humankind rather look at the moon with the same eyes when there's a grave up there? I think we tread very carefully about why we send humans into space. We have to have a good reason for doing so, because, as I said, I think the risk of failure is now in a different way than it was perhaps with Apollo, where, gung-ho and, people die and sacrifices are made and so on. So the answer of your question, rather long way around it, the answer to your question is, if humans were in the loop, we would have been a lot slower.
Interesting.
And we would look at the landing on Mars much more cautiously than perhaps we would ever look at the landing of a rover. But in my opinion, if the purpose to get to Mars is to do the science, to look at, detecting life and so on, let's leave it to robots.
Who do you think will lead the race to space in the future? Will it be private institutions like SpaceX, or will it be NASA again? Will it be ESA? Who will it be? What do you think?
Well, I refer you back to my first comment just now. I think space is two types. So, who is going to lead the drive in satellite opportunities in space? Satellites for science, satellites for applications, satellites for security. There's a whole series of domains that satellites will remain very relevant for. Increasingly, I think that is going to be the private sector. I think they are getting to the point now where they can demonstrate commercial services, at least sustainable services. They might even be able to play a leading role in science missions in the future, because there might be new business models that allow different financing structures to allow science to be done. I'm sure there are people out there who would love to know more about what's the constitute of asteroids, what they're made of, because there might be some commercial opportunities. So why not do some science around asteroid monitoring and so on? So I think the new space community will increasingly become more relevant. I think we still have an issue about orbit debris and management and access and legislation. That's a slightly different agenda, and governments still have a really important role, I think, to make sure there is a level playing field for everyone, and that we're not treating space as the Wild West. I think in terms of space exploration, and by that I mean exploration through humankind as opposed to sending more satellites out to explore planets, which I regard as, the satellite side, the robotic side, I think that will still be government. I think until we see some sort of, manufacturing environment in space where we're going to be doing in-space mining for resources, which frankly could be a good, that could be a good business reason why we should do so, but probably not for a generation. I think it's governments that are still going to be doing it. Governments have to operate collaboratively to do so. I haven't yet seen a science fiction program that doesn't show, the United Nations of space alliances or something going out and doing it, because it's so expensive as much as anything else. I worry that programs like Artemis that the Americans are promoting has not yet fully embraced all nations. I think China must become part of any space exploration initiative. And I worry that at the moment, we might well see nations still striving to do something in space for the sake of doing it, rather than having a global agenda that we should all subscribe to. I would really like to see any space exploration, human exploration, to be driven by, say, the UN, rather than, say, a NASA. I mean, I'd like the UN to perhaps be the customer, and NASA and other space agencies simply be the delivery mechanism. But I would want the UN to, own the purposes and the rules and the establishment of the goals, rather than space agencies who, have very narrow focus as to why they go there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I'd want there to be poets in space as opposed to just, engineers.
Mm-hmm.
I worry, however, that the costs are still so far outside normality that we can only just justify costs by going into space exploration by citing other equally expensive activities and saying, well, hey, we spend all this money on the military, so surely we can spend all this money on going to the moon or Mars. I think we have to have better arguments than that.
That notion to bring poets into space reminded me of a mission, and I cannot recall who is behind that one. Is it Elon who announced a mission and bring artists on board?
Yeah, I believe that's the case.
That's the right approach.
Well, it is and it isn't. It is in the sense that I want the space exploration agenda to be very much about the inspiration and the opportunities within reason. I mean, people say, humanity is naturally an exploring race. I actually disagree with that. I think we look at that from hindsight. I think most of the reasons we explored in the past was to find food, resources, economy. I mean, that's why they broadened into the Wild West and so on. I think there are resources out in space that we might wish to appropriate. I'm not yet sure how near we are to the point where we need those resources. But certainly if we do go out into space for those reasons, then I think it has to be done as a global buy-in. I just don't yet know at what point does it become acceptable to do it versus the risks of loss of life. Elon might well want to launch 100 people to the surface of Mars, but I mean, let's be realistic. It's not going to lead to, mass diaspora out to those places. As I've said elsewhere to people, there isn't a piece of Earth. There's not 1 square kilometer on this planet that is not more beautiful than any 1 square kilometer anywhere else in the solar system. People will disagree with me on that, but you'll be sitting in your hermetically sealed bubble. You won't be able to smell the grass or feel the wind. Yes, it'll be great for scientists, but really, I mean, is it credible that people will want to bring children up in those sorts of environments? Not in my lifetime, certainly.
That would already be a beautiful way to end this podcast. But I have one more question. In fact, two. In the beginning, you mentioned that you were an avid amateur astronomer with a passion for sketching what you observe. So are you taking pen and paper to reproduce what you see through the telescope, or do you have an artistic approach to it?
I do it. You're correct. I'm not an astrophotographer. I enjoy the experience of sitting at a telescope, looking and capturing photons from distant galaxies into my eyes. Admittedly, they are generally very fuzzy, and admittedly, I'm generally very cold when this is happening. But for me, it's communal. I get a sense of being part of a bigger picture. I found that with some approaches with astrophotography, you spend more time on the computer and creating an image that you never saw. You get an image that looks like what you would like it to be because you've seen it through the Hubble image. If an image is fuzzy, then I want to record it as fuzzy. But by drawing, by sketching, I find I spend more time thinking about what it is I'm doing. I'm spending half an hour there. And I'll give you a very simple example that is perhaps very personal to me. I was out the other night looking at Mars and sketching Mars. And, by taking the time to look at Mars and trying to understand, well, that's part of my own journey. I mean, one of the beauties of being involved in the Beagle program was those of us involved in the software were able to code our names into the software embedded system on the spacecraft, on the lander. And, the fact that it landed, and we hope in one piece, means I can look at Mars and know there's a bit of me sort of there on the surface. And I get that enjoyment, but, my daughters will be able to look out when I'm gone and know, well, Dad's up there. And I get that when I'm doing my sketching. I get that sense of connection to the thing I look at rather than, hey, I've just captured 50 megabits or gigabits of data. I'm going to sit for 4 hours on my computer and come up with a picture. Well, it just looked like the Hubble that we built and launched all those years ago. So if Hubble can do it, leave it to Hubble.
Sure. Thank you so much. Chris, we do have a fun tradition at the end of our beautiful little podcast here, and it is called Space Cafe Podcast. And if you like, I don't know, do you like coffee? You're a tea drinker, I guess.
No, I'm addicted to coffee.
Good.
That's the
so you know what an espresso is.
Yes.
Good. And so as this is a Space Cafe podcast, I would like to have a quick shot of inspiration when it comes to a story related to space, a story related to science, something that you would like to share with us without much thinking.
The one topic I would really like to get across to people is the Disaster Charter. The International Disaster Charter is a noble organization of 16 or more space agencies who freely provide satellite data to nations around the world in the event of human natural disasters such as floods and so on. I had the privilege to lead that organization for 6 months a couple of years ago. It was the most active period of its history. We encountered 36 disasters in a 6-month period.
Wow.
Sadly, I heard today that I've lost a very dear friend of mine who sadly passed away. I would love the International Disaster Charter, and she was involved in that. I would love that organization to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
I've heard the space station is being offered. I would love some of you listening to this podcast to find a way to help promote and recommend the International Disaster Charter for the Nobel Peace Prize. That would be awesome, truly awesome. And I'm sorry it became more of an Americano than a latte. Espresso. But hey, that's what you get with me.
Wonderful. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show and such a privilege. Thank you for taking the time. Dear listeners, if you want to learn more about Chris Lee and his work, please do go to our website, SpaceWatch.Global. We will provide all the relevant links to quench your thirst for information. And if you have any questions, as usual, please do not hesitate getting back to us. And perhaps you have some interesting stories to tell or some interesting questions to ask. So please do get back to us. Again, Chris, this is the end of our show. Thanks for taking the time. And we'll watch the progress of your work, because I think that your passion for space is not ending with the end of your role as a chief scientist in the UK Space Agency, I believe.
You can count on it.
So, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Marcus.
So, if you have made it to this point, please consider rating us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. And if you want to show the world that you're a space watcher, you know what to do. Order your set of t-shirts in a breeze on our website, SpaceWatch.Global. As always, thank you for listening.